Stratton and the Lecture Circuit, 1856 to 1865. Reuniting with Lorenzo. Lorenzo, now 19 years old, was still working in El Monte, California, when he received word of his sister's return. He arrived at Fort Yuma to reunite with Olive in late March 1856, a few weeks after her arrival. They were each 5 years older, now adults. Lorenzo, no longer the skinny kid, had put weight on and now looked more like their father, Royce. Olive, of course, was still tanned and rugged, and it was hard not to notice the tattoos. Their meeting was reportedly quite awkward, as they didn't speak for the better part of an hour. Perhaps by 19th century standards, it wouldn't have been easy to just jump right back into their old relationship and start processing their trauma together out loud. Before leaving Fort Yuma, Olive said her final goodbye, in their shared Mohave language, to Tokwatha, her Mohave friend who was part of the return party and the man anthropologist Alfred Kroeber interviewed decades later. Tokwatha was back in camp after spending some time among the Quechan. He later told Kroeber that Olive told him that she would tell everyone about the Mohave and how she lived with them. A week after reuniting, Lorenzo and Olive departed for California. First San Diego, then Los Angeles. People were curious, full of pity, and soon came the judgment. Journalists, politicians, and a first cousin looking to capitalize on their notoriety. Like Lorenzo before her, Olive reconnected with some of the former Brewsterite families, including a girl who was her best friend on the trail. Olive gave interviews to newspapers, recounting her experiences, and was generous in praise and spoke warmly of her time with the Mohave. On Chief Espanol, the caring and kind Espanol. Olive also mentioned how the Mohave told her that she could go to the white settlements whenever she liked, but that they, the Mohave, were afraid to accompany her for fear of retribution. During these early interviews, particularly when Olive said anything positive about her time with the Mohave, she was criticized and determined to be lacking in her faculties in saying such kind things about the, quote, savages she was prisoner to. It's hard not to chalk some of this BS up to sexism, as any woman who spoke, well, at all, but especially against accepted convention, was then seen as having something wrong with her. From those people closer to Olive, they noticed signs of loneliness and sadness from her during these weeks and months. She later recounted how she missed the people and the land of her Mohave home. Stratton. Later that year, 1856, Olive and Lorenzo followed that first cousin, Harvey Oatman, back to his home in Oregon. It is here that they came into contact with Reverend Royal B. Stratton, a name straight out of a movie script. Stratton was a charismatic Methodist preacher, reminiscent of Lorenzo's namesake, that preacher from Royce's youth, if a less famous version. Stratton would ghostwrite a book of Olive and Lorenzo's experiences. Stratton wasn't particularly experienced as a writer, nor as someone with any knowledge of, or even experience in, the Western frontier. He came to California from New York, but on a ship by way of Panama. Stratton's over-the-top language and factual inaccuracies, not to mention clear anti-Indian biases, in the book, all point towards him having what we might now call creative control of the narrative. Footnote: I found no real evidence of Stratton being a bad guy, or that he wasn't at least somewhat interested in raising money for Olive and Lorenzo to go to school. But I'll admit, the idea of him does ruffle my feathers a bit. It feels exploitative and opportunistic. And at this point in our story, I can feel myself getting a bit protective of our Olive Oatman. So, if you sense any doubts and bias on my part, there you go. The Captivity of the Oatman Girls was published in the spring of 1857. It included illustrations from Olive's life story, with a portrait with a full view of that iconic tattoo on the cover. The book very much fit the mold of captivity books written in the 19th century, which was then already a genre unto itself. Stratton seemed to have a bit of an agenda from the beginning. Some might say, more generously, that he knew what would sell. I am not among those so generous. For example, while there's plenty of religious overtones in the book, it never once mentions that the Oatman family were Mormons. Mormons had long been persecuted, not least for their polygamous beliefs. But disavowing the practice as Brewsterite followers or not, one would imagine Stratton didn't want to bring any bad press into the Olive Oatman story. That same year, 1857, would bring war between the federal government and the Mormons, as well as the infamous Mountain Meadows Massacre. So perhaps Stratton leaving out the Mormon connections played some role in the lasting fame and long-term interest in Olive Oatman. And perhaps less forgivable, from the very first edition, the Stratton book contradicts much of Olive's early interviews, instead painting the Mohave in a much darker light. Despite a mountain of bad reviews, the book sold quite well. Well enough that it seems to have funded educational pursuits for Olive and Lorenzo. Subsequent editions were soon called for and delivered with additional commentary and different illustrations. These editions sold well too. The popularity of the book even reached the stage. In San Francisco, there was a play about the Oatman family, with husband and wife actors playing the roles of a fictional Indian and Olive, respectively. And, I kid you not, those actors were the famous older brother and sister-in-law of the then famous and soon to be infamous actor John Wilkes Booth. Footnote. Speaking of Booth and this stream of Civil War references, Lincoln himself will have a tiny cameo when we return to our story back where it started in that New York lecture hall in 1864. Our next section, in fact, takes us one step closer to that. New York, 1858. In 1858, Stratton, his family, and Olive and Lorenzo moved to upstate New York, traveling again by way of Panama by ship. And soon, more editions of the book were published. While in New York, Lorenzo wrote to his Uncle Asa and his Aunt Sarah being his mother's sister, of their arrival and their intentions to make a business out of the book and their story. Footnote. I'm not going to judge a couple of 19th century orphan survivors for trying to scrape together a living by selling their story. But I am fascinated about what went into that decision. Was it enthusiasm for the big cities of New York and the East? Of entrepreneurship and making a few bucks? Or was it a little less sunny and maybe seen as the best or only hope for supporting themselves? For Olive in particular, who was about to enter the celebrity life of the day, did she know what was coming? Could she have known? Unlike other returning captives, Olive had a unique inability to really hide amongst the crowd. That tattoo was the first thing people saw when they saw her, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Given all that Olive has survived by this point, maybe I should give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that she knew what she was doing. Part of this time in New York was spent with Olive and Lorenzo's great uncle, Moses Sperry, in Rochester. Uncle Moses arranged for Olive to have some professional photos taken ahead of the upcoming book tour. When you Google Olive Oatman, you'll see the photos from these sessions. In some, she's standing full length, hand resting on a high-back chair, while in others, she's sitting on a bench that's out of view. She's wearing the same dress with a corset, a high neck, and big round buttons. It's hard to tell in black and white, but the dress is maybe a light gray or a light blue. A keen eye might spot the crosshatch pattern on the hem and the sleeves of the dress. They, of course, mirror the tattoo on her chin, so somebody knew what they were doing. Olive, Uncle Moses, maybe the photographer. Copies of these photos went for $1 on her tour. 19th century merch, I guess. Footnote. I've also found photos of Olive in the dress dated later than 1858, so perhaps she utilized the photo dress multiple times. The lecture circuit. The book tour began with Stratton as the opener, lecturing on Indians and the West, neither of which he knew well at all, with Olive and Lorenzo to follow, with stories of their experiences. The purpose was always to move paper, to sell the book. So, some tidbits and details were shared, but some were strategically withheld. Soon, it was clear that everyone had come to see Olive, and she became the main attraction. She had a knack for public speaking, and she had an amazing story. And sure, the tattoo was a big draw, but it was more than just that. She was more than a spectacle, not just someone to pity and stare at. Olive had charisma and a sense of dramatic storytelling. Her resilience and fortitude were evident in person. She had survived more in her young life than people in her audience 2 or 3 times her age. Even her name was made for public consumption. Olive Oatman. Olive Oatman is like Jesse James or Clark Kent. The alliteration is right out of a storybook. Reviews of the time tell of her hold over the crowds as she shared the stories of her life. She spoke from notes, which were revised over time, but stayed consistent with the themes of the book. Unfortunately, these themes include slave marks for the tattoos, but also in her affinity for Espanol, Espanio, and Topeka. Rightfully in control of her own story, maybe for the first time in her life, Olive was finding her place at a good time. Increased levels of female readership, a growing fascination with the West, and a host of other factors added a little wind to her sails. Speaking for a fee took her around the Northeast and into the Midwest. From those promotional pictures in 1858 to well into the Civil War years of the 1860s, Olive was making her own living, her own way, telling the world her story. Not to say any of this was easy. Celebrity at that time as well was a double-edged sword, to say the least. Who would blame her for leaning into a somewhat fictionalized version of her captive story? Once she picked that lane to go down, it would have been hard to give that up or change course. She was the lady with the tattoo. But she was also that poor dear whose family was murdered right in front of her, and other such pitiable and prejudiced points of view. To state the obvious, it was not common for a woman to speak publicly in 19th century America. Never mind a single woman. Never mind a single woman talking about very personal experiences. A single woman talking about very personal experiences with a tattoo on her chin from those very experiences. I've read, but can't confirm, that Olive may have been the first white woman in America to publicly display tattoos. Even if she wasn't the first, her lecture tour was still a notable feat. Knowing what we know now, who Olive is, and what she's been through, let's think back to the very beginning of this in situ museum. What it must have been like to attend one of her lectures. Lecture Hall, New York, 1864. It's 7:45 on a Friday night. The show begins in 15 minutes, and the doors have just opened. People file into a lecture hall in an orderly fashion and quickly take their seats, talking amongst themselves. Husbands and wives, friends and neighbors. Familiar faces from church. Even some children. The wait is finally over. Tonight is the night. For weeks, the papers have been running articles about this woman, with headlines like "Massacre in the Desert," "Captured and lived to tell about it," "Redeemed," "The Scars of Slavery." Like so many families, hers went west, hoping for a better life. Like so many families, hers didn't make it. Just minutes from now, a young woman, unaccompanied by a husband or a father, will be giving a talk about these shocking experiences that changed her life forever. She'll talk about her mother and father, and about her 6 brothers and sisters. She'll talk about that horrific February day in 1851 at the Gila River, where her family was killed right in front of her, and how she was taken captive by the killers. She'll speak of her 5 years living with the Indians, eating their food, speaking their language, learning their ways. And, word is, she'll also speak of the marks they made, those 5 vertical lines, like ragged claw marks, permanently tattooed on her chin. A couple of Mohave in New York City. Around the time of these high-profile lectures, Olive saw an interesting headline in the New York Times. Arrival of the Indian warrior Iritaba. Iritaba was a Mohave man, so, of course, the article described his fine appearance, 6'2" and quite muscular. Fresh off a meeting with Abraham Lincoln, who gifted him a silver-headed cane, Iritaba was in New York City as part of his diplomatic tour of the East Coast, trying to find better ways of working with the whites, with whom his people, the Mohave, were having more and more contact. In fact, Iritaba has been in the background of much of our story. He was a guide for the Sitgreaves expedition in 1851, when Olive and Mary Ann were with the Tokapaya, and a guide for the Whipple expedition in 1854, when they passed through Mohave territory just south of Olive and Mary Ann's village. In the years between these times, Iritaba also guided Jack Swilling, future founding father of Phoenix, and an assortment of who's who of Arizona and Southwest history. Iritaba was even friends with Tokwatha, so it's hard to imagine Olive not knowing this man from her previous Mohave life. Footnote. By the way, if you're looking to research anyone after this in situ museum, as a close second to Sarah Bowman, I would recommend Iritaba. Not only for his Olive connections, but his entire life, including his return to the Mohave lands and efforts to save his people. Back in 1854, New York City, Olive made an inquiry or two, and 8 long years after leaving the Mohave, she was face to face with Iritaba at the very fancy Metropolitan Hotel. They could each speak the other's native language, but they conversed in the Mohave language. He, explaining why he was so far from home and the experiences he had had. She, on her own path to New York, before asking about those back home in the Mohave Valley. Iritaba told Olive how much Topeka and her adoptive family missed her and hoped that she might return someday. Of all places to reunite with a Mohave kinsman, at a fancy hotel in New York City. Olive's later writings and speeches of the moment do have tones of condescension about her former Mohave family. But, while not excusing it, it is important to remember the position Olive was in. The position she was always in. That is, always in consideration of who her audience was. I'm choosing to emphasize a warm reunion with a friend who might have reminded her of days of belonging and of familial bonds, especially when times were tough. In the next section, child and epilogue. But before moving on, what do you think about Olive post-Mohave? New York City? Lecture circuit? Making her own way in the world? Are you surprised? Impressed? What do you think is next for Olive? Talk it over with your group, and when you're ready, go ahead and play the last section. Life After the Massacre, Fairchild and Epilogue, 1865 to 1903.